For 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days, Edwin Moses did not lose a 400-meter hurdles race. 122 consecutive victories turned him into one of the most dominant athletes the world had ever seen. But behind that extraordinary streak was a story few people understood. Moses was not simply trying to win races. He was trying to control every detail of his performance, while dealing with Olympic disappointment, crushing expectations, physical limits, and a sport he believed was losing its way. The most fascinating part of his story is not that he became almost impossible to beat. It is what happened when the perfect streak finally ended. Edwin Moses did not grow up looking like the obvious future of American athletics. As a teenager, he tried football and basketball before settling on track. He eventually discovered that individual competition suited him because the results seemed simple. Get to the finish line first. There were no teammates to blame, no complicated calculations about possession or strategy. There was only the athlete, the clock, and the barriers ahead. At Morehouse College, Moses studied physics. The college had a track team, but it did not even have its own track. That detail says almost everything about how unusual his rise was. Moses began treating training like a scientific experiment. He recorded his workouts. He studied conditions. He analyzed distances, rhythm, technique, and fatigue. Instead of simply accepting conventional hurdling methods, he tried to understand why certain movements worked and how they could be repeated under pressure. The result became his signature. Most 400-meter hurdlers used 14 steps between the barriers. Moses developed a 13-step pattern, allowing him to maintain a powerful rhythm while reducing the number of adjustments he needed to make during the race. Then came Montreal in 1976. Moses was only 20 years old and had arrived at his first international competition without the reputation of an established superstar. He left Canada as an Olympic champion and world record holder. His winning time was 47.63 seconds, and he had become the only American man to win a track and field gold medal at those games. Years later, Moses admitted that if someone had told him in 1974 or 1975 that he would become an Olympic champion, he would not have believed it. That is what makes the beginning of his story so compelling. The greatest 400-meter hurdler of his generation did not arrive with a perfect plan. He built one, and once he discovered that his method worked, he became obsessed with making it better. The world was about to discover what happened when scientific discipline met extraordinary talent. After Montreal, Moses entered a different world. He was no longer an unknown college athlete. He was the man everyone wanted to beat. But the remarkable thing was that nobody could. On August 26, 1977, Moses lost to West Germany's Harald Schmid in Berlin. That would be his last defeat for almost a decade. What followed became one of the most astonishing winning streaks in sports history. Moses won 122 consecutive races over 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days. During that period, he won another Olympic gold medal, a world championship, and repeatedly lowered the standards of his event. His world record of 47.02 seconds, set in 1983, remained the benchmark for years. But the numbers tell only half the story. Moses trained for hours every day. He kept detailed records and constantly adjusted his preparation. In later interviews, he described spending 4 to 8 hours a day training because that was what he believed it took to remain at the top. He also understood something most spectators never saw. Winning once is difficult. Winning for years is exhausting. Every victory increases the expectation for the next one. Soon, winning is no longer celebrated as a surprise. It becomes the minimum requirement. Moses once described himself as someone who simply worked harder than anyone else. He rejected the idea that athletes needed shortcuts to compete at the highest level. His philosophy was brutally straightforward. If he wanted to remain ahead, he had to keep improving. That mentality helped create the streak. But it also created an enormous psychological burden. Imagine standing at the starting line knowing that an entire stadium expects you to win because you have done it every time before. Your rivals are not simply racing against you. They are racing against your reputation. And that reputation became almost impossible to escape. Then, in 1980, something happened that no training program could prevent. Moses was prepared to defend his Olympic title in Moscow, but he never got the chance. The race was taken away from him before he could even reach the starting line. If you remember the era, do you think an athlete should be judged by the medals they won, or also by the opportunities that history took away from them? That question would follow Moses for years. The 1980 Moscow Olympics should have been another chapter in Edwin Moses's dominance. Instead, the United States boycotted the Games. Moses was considered the overwhelming favorite in the 400-meter hurdles, but he remained at home. There was no dramatic defeat. No rival crossed the finish line ahead of him. No mistake cost him the title. He simply never received the opportunity to defend the gold medal he had won in Montreal. For an athlete whose entire philosophy was built around preparation and control, that was a painful lesson. You can control your training. You can control your diet. You can control your technique. You can control how you approach the starting line, but you cannot control international politics. Moses eventually returned to the Olympic stage in Los Angeles in 1984. There, in front of an American crowd, he won his second Olympic gold medal. The victory restored the image of the dominant champion. But by then, something had changed. Moses understood that athletic greatness existed inside a world much larger than athletics. Politics could determine whether you competed. Organizations could determine the rules. And later, he would become increasingly concerned about another force that he believed could undermine everything clean athletes work to achieve. Before that battle began, however, Moses continued to dominate. He won race after race. His technique became almost mechanical in its consistency. 13 steps between hurdles. Controlled rhythm. Relentless preparation. His opponents knew exactly what he was going to do. They simply could not stop him. Then came 1987. For nearly 10 years, the impossible had become normal. The world had started to believe that Edwin Moses might never lose again. But every perfect streak has one dangerous weakness. It only takes one race to end it. And in Madrid, that race finally arrived. June 4th, 1987. Madrid. Edwin Moses entered the race, carrying a record that seemed almost untouchable. 122 consecutive victories. 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days since his previous defeat. Then Danny Harris changed everything. Harris took the lead and held it. Moses fought back during the closing stages, but at the final hurdle, he made an unusually small mistake. He stumbled. It lasted only an instant. But in elite sport, an instant can become an eternity. Harris crossed the finish line in 47.56 seconds. Moses finished in 47.69. The streak was over. For almost a decade, Moses had taught the world what consistency looked like. Now the world was watching him lose. It would have been easy to turn that moment into a tragedy. Instead, Moses handled it with remarkable composure. The defeat did not erase his achievements. It simply reminded everyone that even the greatest athlete is still human. And the timing made the loss even more meaningful. Moses had not suddenly become a poor hurdler. He had simply encountered another athlete on a day when the smallest details went against him. The streak was gone, but Moses was not. Later that same year, he returned to the World Championships in Rome and defeated Harris to reclaim the title. That response may be more revealing than the winning streak itself. When he finally lost, he did not disappear. He adjusted. He continued. Then came Seoul in 1988. Moses entered his final Olympic Games hoping to win another gold medal. Instead, he finished third. There was an extraordinary detail hidden inside that result. His time in Seoul was faster than the times that had won him Olympic gold in both Montreal and Los Angeles. And yet, it was only enough for bronze. That is the cruelty of elite sport. Sometimes you can run faster than the champion you once were and still finish third. Moses had spent years trying to control everything. Now he was learning the hardest lesson of all. You can do almost everything right and still not get the result you want. But Seoul would lead to something even more important, because the same games that ended Moses's Olympic career also strengthened his determination to change the sport itself. The 1988 Seoul Olympics were remembered for many reasons. For Edwin Moses, one moment stood out. The men's 100-meter final became one of the most controversial races in Olympic history after Ben Johnson was stripped of the gold medal following a failed drug test. Moses was already deeply concerned about performance-enhancing drugs in athletics. Now the problem was impossible to ignore. He believed clean athletes deserved a fair opportunity to compete. More importantly, he believed the sport itself was in danger of losing its credibility. Moses later recalled the period bluntly. We all knew doping was happening. He also said that it was a dark period in athletics. But Moses did something unusual. He did not simply complain. He organized. After Seoul, he brought together a group of American athletes and pushed for random testing outside major competitions. The idea was simple but powerful. If testing happened only at competitions, athletes could potentially avoid detection by using prohibited substances outside competition periods. Moses and his colleagues helped develop protocols, secure support, and establish a system for out-of-competition testing in the United States. He later became chief of United States testing from 1989 through 1994. This was the second career of Edwin Moses. The first had been about mastering his own body. The second was about challenging the system surrounding every athlete. And there was a powerful irony in that transformation. Moses had spent his entire competitive career searching for legal advantages. He used physics. He studied movement. He recorded training data. He worked with physical therapists. He searched for tiny improvements that could produce a faster race. He believed that excellence could be built through discipline. So when he saw athletes searching for another path, he did not see merely a rule violation. He saw a threat to the entire philosophy that had shaped his life. Someone had to act, Moses later said. If nobody else was stepping forward, he would. That decision changed his legacy. He was no longer simply the man nobody could beat. He was becoming the man willing to challenge the system after he had already conquered the track. And that fight would continue long after his own racing career ended. There is one opponent no athlete can defeat forever: time. By the end of the 1980s, Moses was still physically capable of competing at the highest level. In an interview in 1989, he insisted that he still enjoyed the sport and believed he had races left to run. But he also acknowledged the danger of injuries at the later stages of a career. That admission revealed something important. Even the most scientific training system has limits. Moses had spent years using physical therapy, stretching, muscle balancing, and careful preparation to protect his body. He understood that remaining at the top required more than simply running harder. It required knowing when to stop pushing. His final Olympic appearance had already happened in Seoul. His final competitive season came in 1989. By then, the streak was history. The Olympic gold medals were behind him. The world records belonged to another chapter. And the athlete who had once seemed almost machine-like was finally stepping away from the track. But retirement did not mean disappearance. Moses continued working in sports administration and athlete advocacy. He later became chairman of the Laureus World Sports Academy and remained involved in efforts to improve sport and support young people. His story even took an unexpected detour into bobsledding, proving that retirement from one sport did not mean a complete withdrawal from competition. But perhaps the most revealing part of his later life was the shift in purpose. During his racing career, the question was, can Edwin Moses win? After retirement, the question became, what can Edwin Moses change? That is a completely different definition of success. The young athlete from Morehouse had once approached sport like a scientific problem. The older Moses began approaching it like a social responsibility. The hurdles had taught him rhythm. Competition had taught him discipline. Defeat had taught him humility. And the problems inside athletics had taught him that winning alone was not enough. The finish line had disappeared, but the race had not. It had simply changed direction. At the beginning of this story, one number seemed to define Edwin Moses: 122. 122 consecutive victories. 9 years, 9 months, and 9 days without defeat. It is an extraordinary record. But numbers cannot tell you what it felt like to carry the expectation of winning every time you stepped onto a track. They cannot explain what it meant to lose an Olympic opportunity without ever being given the chance to race. They cannot measure the shock of watching an almost perfect winning streak disappear because of one small mistake at one final hurdle. And they cannot capture what it meant to finish third at an Olympic Games after running faster than the times that had previously won him gold. That is why the real story of Edwin Moses is bigger than his record. He was an accidental champion who became a scientific innovator. He was an Olympic champion who lost an Olympic opportunity. He was an athlete who became nearly unbeatable, then learned how to live with defeat. And after his competitive career, he became an advocate who believed that the sport he loved needed to become better. The perfect streak ended. The medals eventually stopped coming. The body eventually demanded rest. but the principles remained. Moses once wanted to be remembered as the man nobody could beat. For almost a decade, he got exactly what he wanted. Yet his greatest legacy may have come afterward. Because winning proves what you can do. What you do after winning proves what you believe. And what you do after losing reveals who you really are. So perhaps the most important question is not whether Edwin Moses was the greatest 400-meter hurdler of all time. It is this: what does it cost to become unbeatable? And what do you do when you finally are beaten? Moses answered with action. He kept learning. He kept fighting. And when the finish line disappeared, he found another race. If you remember watching Edwin Moses during his greatest years, share that memory in the comments. If you discovered his story later, tell us which part surprised you most. And if another sports legend comes to mind whose greatest battle happened away from the spotlight, share that name. Because sometimes the most important victory is not the one that appears on the scoreboard. Sometimes it is the one that continues long after the race is over.